In our previous videos, we discussed the diminishing returns nature of volume. So volume does have a relationship with hypertrophy. However, it's not linear, but we do need to track it because volume does give us some indication as to the stimulus and the fatigue we're going to experience. Now, in the research and also in practice, there's been different ways of tracking volume over time. Probably the most dominant one for a long time until perhaps the last 5 or 6 years was what's called tonnage or volume load. Volume load is simply a calculation of multiplying sets times reps times load. So you get a pretty large number and you can compare that against other people, yourself, between lifts, etc. And this was something that a lot of lifters did, a lot of coaches did, and you'll often see in the research to compare different levels of volume. Now, with that said, for the specific goal of hypertrophy, there are some minor issues with tracking volume load. Let's first just discuss this broadly. Change to any of those 3 factors, sets, reps, or load, can make volume load comparisons a little less intuitive than you might think. Let's take it out of the context of hypertrophy and think about the volume load that 2 world champion powerlifters might be producing if they're doing the same number of reps and the same number of sets at the same RPE or proximity to failure. Except one is a male 120 plus kilo lifter, a super heavyweight, and one is a lightweight female, a 52 kilo lifter. Now, they're both world champions. They both maybe have similar requirements for volume, maybe not. But their strength is going to be very different. If you're a world champion in the 52 kilo class, your squat might be somewhere in the 150 to 160 kilo range. However, if you're a world champion in the 120 plus kilo range, it's going to be over 400 kilos. That means that you can expect a 2.5 to 3-fold difference in volume load, even if you do the same number of reps, the same number of sets at the same RIR. And the question begs, would we expect those to be different stimuli for these 2 people? Would we expect them to have different recovery demands? Perhaps, but I think you can see my point that you shouldn't let someone's strength necessarily dictate the quantification of their volume if you're interested in knowing about the fatigue or the stimulus they're experiencing. But more importantly, since this is bodybuilding program design and we're focused on hypertrophy, we're tracking volume because we want to get a rough idea of both the stimulus and the fatigue that we're experiencing. So for that reason, we're going to use a different method. But let's explain really in depth how tracking volume load, even for the purposes of hypertrophy, can throw you off a bit. Consider that the hypertrophy rep range is pretty broad. Ultimately, and I'll talk about this more in a second, we want to make sure that sets last long enough to produce a long enough tension stimulus for all of our muscle, but we also don't want them to be so long and be very, very, very high rep so that the load on the bar is so low that it starts generating cardiometabolic fatigue and actually interfering with the stimulus we can get from that set for a hypertrophy perspective. So ultimately, we want to be somewhere in the range of, say, 5 to 20, maybe 25 or 30 reps, and that is probably going to be equivalent on a set-by-set basis if the RIR or RPE, proximity to failure, is similar. Now, that's just for hypertrophy. But let's give you an example. We'll take 2 different workouts that are on the end of these 2 extremes, a relatively low-rep bodybuilding set and a relatively high-rep bodybuilding set. Let's say we've got someone with 165 kilogram 1-rep max. For the Americans, that's roughly 365 pounds. Now let's say the plan is to do 3x15 and make those sets pretty hard. That's about 60% of 1RM. For most people, that's going to be pretty close to failure, but perhaps not there until the final set, assuming you rest enough between sets. Now, if we were to do this, we would get a volume load multiplying 3 by 15 by 100 kilograms of 4,500 kilograms. That's a lot of volume, right? However, if we did 3 by 6 times 140 kilograms, or 85% of 1RM, which would also be hard, also be reasonably close to failure, it would only be 2,520 kilograms of volume. That's nearly a 2-fold difference. But would we expect there to be twice the stimulus doing 3 by 15? Would we expect there to be twice the fatigue? Maybe immediately, because 15 reps is pretty challenging in a high RIR, but would we think about there being more muscle damage or fatigue that would accumulate and bleed over into subsequent sessions? Probably not. In fact, the data broadly supports that when you have a set, even within a similar rep range, or even a quite divergent rep range, something like 6 and 15, for the outcome of hypertrophy, not strength, you get the similar outcome so long as RIR is held constant and number of sets are held constant. For example, check out Lopez 2021. This is a meta-analysis of 28 studies with 747 subjects, all of which in these very different studies are training to failure, but just with different loads and comparing a similar number of sets. And while you do see higher strength gains for those doing sets with lower reps, you see equivalent hypertrophy across the board. So, as I've said, when it comes to hypertrophy specifically, it has much more to do about proximity to failure and number of total sets than it does the actual number of reps per set within a reasonable range or the load on the bar. And that's why one of the other methods of tracking volume, just counting reps, is something that most of the industry has stepped away from. I actually advise counting just reps in the first edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids and also in the original videos that those books were based upon. And that's because back in that era, 10 years ago, we had limited data, and there was only one systematic review that kind of looked at the relationships between number of reps as a rough proxy for volume. But now that we have more data, we can step away from that, because just counting reps actually causes the same problem as volume load and just amplifies it. If you think about that same example, counting reps is just multiplying sets times reps and taking load out of it. So if we did 3 by 15 compared to 3 by 6, we're looking at 45 versus 18 reps. That's nearly a threefold difference, but we absolutely wouldn't expect 3 times the fatigue or 3 times the stimulus doing 3 by 15 versus 3 by 6 based upon the data we have. So what do we recommend? Well, it's actually quite simple, and it makes tracking very intuitive, and that's the number of working sets. And we are going to be performing working sets at a reasonably high RPE or a low RIR because the goal is hypertrophy, and that's important. And in fact, not only do we believe that that's the best way to do it in the trenches, the literature supports that. In fact, check out this systematic review by Baz Val that came out in 2021, where they looked at a bunch of different studies that looked at hypertrophy and found that indeed, so long as there was a reasonable proximity to failure or the individuals were training quote unquote hard enough, the number of sets was a good proxy for the amount of hypertrophy that occurred. So their final recommendation was to perform somewhere between roughly 6 to 20 reps at a reasonably high RPE. And that's exactly what we recommend. Now, just consider once again that we do have to think about the reps per set. If we perform too few reps per set, even if that is pretty close to failure, meaning we're training heavy, we're doing, say, doubles or triples or fours, that's great. That is going to be a very high stimulus per rep. But the total number of reps per set is so low that we might not get enough of a tension stimulus for all fibers. And indeed, there are data showing that when you're doing too low of reps per set, you can't count sets and compare them on a one-to-one basis. You have to do more sets to make up for those higher rep sets that they're being compared to. And likewise, if you do really high rep sets using very low loads, there does seem to be a point somewhere in around the range of doing, say, more than 30 or 40 reps per set, where even if you go to failure, you might get a lower stimulus for hypertrophy. That could be due to the cardiometabolic fatigue actually interfering with your ability to gauge failure or actually push your muscles to the point of failure to get that stimulus. And it may be a little more like cardio than others lifting weights. But a decent rule of thumb is to do at least roughly 5 to 6 reps per set and probably stop somewhere in the range of 20 to 30, and that is dependent upon the exercise you choose. So to summarize, the number of working sets is the way we're going to be counting our hypertrophy volume for the purposes of this course.